She walked down his staircase wearing nothing but his bathrobe, and she looked him dead in the eyes and said, "It's time to stop pretending." Ethan Brooks hadn't moved, hadn't breathed. For a full 10 seconds he just stood there in his own kitchen, holding a coffee mug he forgot was in his hand. He had no idea what she meant. But something in his chest cracked open like it had been waiting years for exactly those words. What happened next would change both of them forever. But not in the way either of them expected. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You don't want to miss where this goes. Ethan Brooks slammed the wrench down on the workbench so hard, the whole garage shook. It was 11:47 at night. He'd been out on a call since 4 in the afternoon, a busted compressor unit in a commercial kitchen 30 miles out. And by the time he got home, his back was locked up, his knuckles were scraped raw, and the only thing he wanted in the world was a cold beer and 8 hours of silence. What he got instead was a dark house, a note from his daughter taped to the refrigerator that said, "Leftovers in the microwave, don't stay up, Dad." And the sound of his neighbor's water pipes screaming through the thin summer air like something dying. He ignored it. He heated up the pasta. He drank the beer standing over the sink. He didn't even bother turning on a light. That was how Ethan lived. Quietly. Efficiently. In the dark, when he could get away with it. 43 years old, and he had gotten very good at taking up as little space as possible. He'd moved to Harlow Lake 9 years ago, right after the divorce was finalized. Not because it was a great town, not because he had family there or knew anyone. He'd picked it almost at random, staring at a map of the Michigan lakeshore with a cup of gas station coffee going cold beside him, thinking, somewhere no one knows my name. Somewhere I can just be nobody for a while. He bought the house on Linden Street for less than he expected, mostly because it needed work. And Ethan was very good at work. Work, he understood. Work didn't require you to feel anything in particular. You showed up, you diagnosed the problem, you fixed it, you moved on. His daughter, Maya, had been 8 when they moved in. She was 17 now. Sharp, funny, occasionally terrifying in the way only teenage girls can be. And she had built a whole life for herself in Harlow Lake. Friends, school plays, a part-time job at the ice cream place by the marina. She had roots here. Ethan sometimes felt like he was still just passing through. Claire Harper had moved in next door 11 months ago. He remembered the day clearly. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because he'd watched from his garage window as the movers carried in box after box of books. Not a TV, not furniture first, not the sensible stuff. Books. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. He'd thought, weird. Then he'd gone back to whatever he was doing and hadn't thought about it again. That first week, she knocked on his door to introduce herself. Claire Harper, 38, worked at the county library. Moved from Ann Arbor after a long relationship ended. She said it all very calmly, like she was reading facts off a card, and he'd nodded and said his name was Ethan, and he did HVAC work, and he hoped she'd like the neighborhood. It was the most words he'd said to a stranger in months. She smiled and said, "I already do," and he had no idea what to do with that, so he just nodded again and went back inside. In the months that followed, he noticed her the way you notice weather. She was just there, part of the landscape. She had a habit of sitting on her front porch with a book in the evenings, even when it was cold enough that she needed a blanket. She drove a 10-year-old blue Civic that she parallel parked perfectly every single time, which for some reason annoyed him. She played low music sometimes. Nothing he could ever identify, just a soft drift of sound through the evening air. She grew tomatoes in pots on her front steps and talked to them when she thought no one was listening. He knew all of this not because he was paying attention. He told himself he wasn't paying attention. He was just observant. Came with the job. You notice things. Shit. She'd knocked on his door 5 or 6 times in those 11 months, always with a reason. A bulb she couldn't reach. A recycling question. Once, during a January cold snap, to ask if he could look at her furnace because it was making a sound she described as like a cat being slowly convinced of something. He'd laughed at that. Hadn't meant to. It just came out, a short, surprised sound, and she'd looked at him like she'd discovered something. He fixed her furnace, wouldn't let her pay him. She left a tin of homemade cookies on his porch 2 days later with a note that just said, "Thank you, E." Maya had eaten most of them before he got home and announced that Claire was clearly a good person based solely on the cookies. "You can tell a lot about someone from how they bake," Maya said, completely serious. Ethan had said, "That's not a real thing." Maya had looked at him the way only a 17-year-old can look at a father, like he was lovably, irredeemably wrong. He found out later, much later, that none of those knock-on-the-door moments were entirely accidental, but that came later. That night, the night of the bathrobe, started with the pipes. He heard the knock at 8:14 p.m. He knew the time because he'd just sat down with the remote and actually committed to watching something for the first time in weeks, which meant the universe had a sense of humor. He opened the door. Claire was standing on his porch in a yellow blouse and dark slacks, clearly dressed for something, and she was holding her own arms like she was cold, even though it was a warm August evening. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I know this is strange. The water main on our block just went out. I called the city and they said probably until tomorrow morning, and I have this interview at 8 a.m. tomorrow for a promotion. And I just..." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I need to shower, and I don't know anyone else to ask." He looked at her. He thought about all the very good reasons to say, "I'm sorry. That's rough. Good luck, though." He said, "Come in." Maya was at a friend's house. The place was quiet. He showed Claire to the upstairs bathroom, handed her a clean towel from the hall closet, and then stood in the hallway for a moment after she closed the door, genuinely unsure what to do with himself. He went downstairs. He turned the TV back on. He did not watch it. He sat on the couch and listened to the water running upstairs and felt, for reasons he absolutely could not explain, like something had shifted in the house. Some temperature, some pressure, like the air itself had changed composition. "Stop it," he told himself. "She's just using the shower." He turned the TV up. He still couldn't hear it over the sound of his own thoughts. The water shut off. Silence. He heard her moving around up there, the soft sounds of someone in a bathroom, the small, ordinary sounds that somehow felt completely foreign in his house. Then footsteps on the stairs. He didn't look up right away. He kept his eyes on the screen, which was showing some cooking competition he had zero interest in, and he thought, "Be normal. She'll come down, say thank you, and go home. Be normal." He heard her reach the bottom of the staircase. He looked up. Claire Harper was standing in his living room wearing his bathrobe. It was the old navy blue one, thick cotton, frayed a little at the cuffs, that he kept hanging on the back of the bathroom door. He'd had it for years, hadn't thought about it in months, and there she was, wrapped in it, her dark hair still damp and loose around her shoulders, her feet bare on his hardwood floor. She looked completely at ease. That was the thing that got him. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't apologetic. She stood there like she belonged there, and there was something about it that made his chest do something complicated and unwelcome. "I hope that's okay," she said, gesturing vaguely at the robe. "My clothes got damp somehow. I didn't want to put them back on." Yeah, fine." He found he had nothing else to add to that. She looked at him. He looked back. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, more than a thought. And then she said it. Quietly. Clearly. Looking straight at him. "It's time to stop pretending." Yunt. Ethan stopped breathing. The TV was still on. Some contestant was crying about a soufflé. He could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. All the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening. And those words just hung in the air between them, like a door had opened. "I'm sorry," he said. Claire sat down. Not in the armchair across from him. On the couch. beside him. Not crowding him, but close. Close enough that he could smell his own shampoo in her hair, which was a strange and disorienting thing. "Ethan," she said, "we've lived next door to each other for almost a year." "I know. And I think we've had maybe 40 real conversations. That sounds about right?" "And about 39 of them," she said, "you spent trying very hard to be friendly without actually being there." He didn't answer that. "I notice things," she said simply. "I'm a librarian. I pay attention. And I've been paying attention to you. Claire, let me just—" She held up one hand, patient, unhurried. "I'm not trying to make this weird. I'm just tired of pretending that things are other than they are." "And what are they?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She looked at him steadily. "You're a good man who's decided he isn't one. And I've been standing right next door, wondering when you were going to stop believing your ex-wife's version of you." The room went very still. "What do you know about my ex-wife?" he said carefully. "Nothing," she said. "Only what I can infer from watching a man who apologizes for existing, who waves from his driveway like he's afraid to take up too much space, who fixes everyone else's problems and never knocks on anyone's door with his own." She paused. "I inferred quite a bit." Ethan stood up. He walked to the window. He put his hand on the frame and looked out at the dark street because he needed something solid to hold on to. "You don't know me," he said, not unkindly, just carefully. "No," she agreed. "Not yet. Not yet." He turned around. She was sitting there in his old bathrobe, looking at him with those clear, patient eyes. And something about it was the most frightening thing he'd faced in years. More frightening than the divorce. More frightening than moving to a town where he knew no one. More frightening than all the quiet years he'd stacked up in between. Because she wasn't asking him to be something else. She was looking at him like what was already there was enough. And Ethan Brooks had absolutely no idea what to do with that. "It's getting late," he said. Claire nodded. She stood up. She reached for the folded pile of her clothes on the armchair. He hadn't even noticed she'd brought them down. And she looked at him once more before she went upstairs to change. "I'm not going anywhere, Ethan," she said, "just so you know." He didn't answer. He stood at the window long after she'd gone home, long after the street was dark and empty, long after every reasonable thought he had told him to go to bed. He stood there thinking about a woman in a navy blue bathrobe saying, "Not yet," like she already knew where the story was going. And the worst part, the thing that kept him at that window until well past midnight, was that somewhere deep and honest in himself, he thought maybe she did. He didn't sleep that night. Not even close. Ethan lay on top of his covers with his boots still on until 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling like it owed him an explanation. Then he got up, went downstairs, made coffee he didn't drink, and stood in the kitchen until the sky outside started going gray. He kept replaying it. Not the bathrobe, although that was certainly part of what his brain kept snagging on, which annoyed him. It was the words. The way she said them without flinching, without performing, like she'd been holding them for a long time and had simply decided tonight was the night to put them down. It's time to stop pretending. He'd been pretending for years. He knew that. But he'd gotten so good at it that he'd almost convinced himself the act was the real thing. That the quiet, efficient, take-up-no-space version of Ethan Brooks was just who he was now. Not a shell. Not a choice. Just him. And then Claire Harper walked down his stairs in his bathrobe and looked at him like she could see right through every layer of it. And suddenly, he wasn't sure what was underneath anymore. That scared him more than he wanted to admit. By 6 a.m., he'd made a decision. He was going to be a reasonable adult about this. Claire had a big interview this morning. She'd said something emotional, maybe impulsive, and he was going to give them both space to pretend the whole thing was slightly less significant than it felt. He was very good at pretending, after all. He heard her car start at 7:45. He didn't go to the window. He made Maya breakfast and asked about her night at her friend's house and listened to her talk about some drama involving someone named Jordan and a text that was misread, and he nodded in all the right places and felt like a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't name. Maya paused mid-sentence and looked at him. "Dad, you okay?" "Fine," he said. She studied him with the particular focus teenagers reserve for moments when adults are obviously lying. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I slept fine." She looked at his coffee mug, which he'd filled and set down and forgotten about, and then at his untouched toast. "Sure," she said, in the tone that meant she knew exactly what fine meant, and it didn't mean fine. He let it go. She let it go. They were both good at that. It was one of the ways they worked together, the two of them. They'd learned to leave doors open without forcing each other through them. He wished, briefly and painfully, that he'd learned that skill about 15 years earlier. The morning passed. He had 2 service calls, a refrigeration unit at a diner on Route 9, and a residential AC job on the east side of town. He did both on autopilot, which was fine because he'd done both 100 times. His hands knew what to do even when his head was somewhere else entirely. He thought about what Claire had said, the specific things, not the "it's time to stop pretending" part. He kept deliberately steering away from that. But the other things, the details, the way she'd described watching him, apologizes for existing, afraid to take up too much space, fixes everyone else's problems, and never knocks on anyone's door with his own. He thought about how much it had stung. And then he thought about how much it stung specifically because she was right. That was the part he couldn't shake loose. He got home at 2:30 and found a note tucked under his front door. Not a text. An actual note, handwritten on the kind of card you find in a library gift shop, with a small illustration of a blue heron on the front. He almost didn't pick it up. Then he picked it up and stood in his own doorway reading it. "Got the promotion. Thank you for last night." See, 4 words after the thank you. Short enough that it said nothing. Long enough to say everything. He stood there reading it 3 times. Then he put it in the kitchen drawer, where he kept takeout menus and dead batteries and other things he couldn't bring himself to throw away. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, he'd convinced himself it was over. A single strange night. Emotional. Charged. But ultimately, nothing had happened. She'd said her piece. He'd listened. They'd both gone home. It was fine. It was contained. Then Thursday evening happened. He was in the driveway replacing the brake light on his truck, the kind of thing he did himself, because paying someone else to do something he knew how to do felt like a moral failing. When he heard his daughter's voice from across the yard. "Mrs. Harper, hey!" He looked up. Claire was walking from her car to her front door, briefcase in hand, still dressed from work. "Hey Maya," she called back. "How was school?" "Okay, Mr. Peterson gave us a surprise quiz in history, which should be illegal." Claire laughed. "What was it on?" "The Cold War, which I actually knew, so not a tragedy." "Look at you. Dad's fixing the truck," Maya offered, gesturing at him like he was an exhibit. "He does that instead of watching TV like a normal person." He straightened up. "Thanks for that, Maya." Claire looked at him across the yard, just for a second. He looked back. Neither of them said anything, but something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a small nod to Tuesday night. And then she said, "Nice work," and went inside. That was it. But he noticed that he smiled after she went in. Just briefly, just alone in the driveway with a brake light and the early evening sky. He caught himself doing it and immediately stopped, which was maybe the most embarrassing moment of his recent adult life. Maya saw him stop smiling and tilted her head. What was that? Nothing. That was definitely something. Maya. She raised both hands in surrender and went back inside, and he turned back to the truck, and he stood there for a moment telling himself very firmly that he was not going to do anything stupid. He was going to be careful. He was going to be smart. He was going to remember what happened the last time he let himself believe that someone was genuinely interested in ordinary Ethan Brooks from Linden Street. He was going to remember Melissa. The problem was that for the next 3 days, Claire kept being herself. And herself was a very difficult thing to build a wall against. She didn't push. That was the thing. She didn't follow up on Tuesday night with anything dramatic or pressing. She waved when she saw him. She said good morning when they both happened to be getting their mail at the same time. She brought Maya a book she thought she might like, a thriller, apparently, based on some 30-second conversation they'd had about Maya's taste in fiction, and left it on the porch without making it a big thing. That was Saturday morning. Maya came to find him in the garage, holding the book like it was evidence. "She brought me a book," Maya said. "I see that." She remembered that I said I liked unreliable narrators. Maya looked at the cover, then at Ethan. She remembered that. "She's a librarian. It's her job." Maya gave him the look again, the one that said he was being deliberately obtuse and she was choosing patience. "Dad, she didn't have to do anything. She just did something nice. People do nice things." "You're impossible," Maya said, and went back inside with her book. He was aware, in a way he couldn't fully silence, that his daughter was not wrong. That night he sat on the back porch after Maya went to bed and let himself think, really think, without steering away from it, about what Claire had told him. Not the declaration, but the specific observations. She'd listed things she'd noticed about him, real things, not flattery, not a sales pitch. She'd noticed the way he moved through the world. And the question that started circling, quiet and relentless, was, how long had she been watching? He didn't know why that felt important. It just did. He found out on Sunday. Maya had a shift at the ice cream place, which meant the house was his from noon to 7. He usually filled those hours with work, repairs, maintenance, projects he'd been putting off. But it was raining, a low gray Sunday rain, and the work he needed to do was outside, so he was stuck. He was going through a kitchen cabinet, reorganizing it, which was the kind of thing he did when his hands needed something to do and his brain needed to turn off. When he found the cookies. Or, more accurately, the tin. The tin from January. The thank you cookies Claire had baked after he fixed her furnace. He'd kept it because he kept things sometimes, for no good reason, and then forgot about them. He stood holding the empty tin and thought about the furnace call in January. He'd asked her at the time how long it had been making that noise. She'd said, about a week. But that wasn't right. He'd looked at the unit while he was working on it, and he could tell from the wear pattern that something had been off for at least a month, maybe longer. He hadn't said anything because it didn't matter. There was no damage. He'd fixed it. That was that. But now, standing in his kitchen with an empty cookie tin, he thought about it differently. She'd waited. She'd waited a month with a furnace that was slowly going wrong and then knocked on his door about it. Why? He thought about the other time she'd knocked. The light bulb. He had a clear memory of that. She'd said it was in a fixture she couldn't reach. He remembered going over and replacing it and thinking nothing of it. But Claire Harper was 5'7", maybe 5'8", and the fixture in question was on a standard 8-foot ceiling, and she was not a woman who struck him as someone who couldn't solve a practical problem. He put the tin down slowly. He thought about the recycling question that had turned into a 20-minute conversation on the driveway about nothing in particular. He thought about the Saturday morning 6 months ago when she'd knocked to ask if he could help her carry something heavy up her stairs. A bookcase, some flat pack thing she'd ordered. And afterward she'd made them both coffee, and he'd stayed for almost an hour without entirely understanding how that had happened. He thought about the morning he'd been rushing to get Maya to a doctor's appointment because his truck wouldn't start, and Claire had appeared at his window, keys in hand, saying she'd overheard from her porch, and her car was right there if he needed it. That was the one that stopped him completely. He'd been in a genuine panic that morning. Running late, phone half dead, truck refusing to cooperate. And Claire had been on her porch, on a Wednesday morning, before 8 a.m. He stood in his kitchen and he did the math on that slowly and carefully. Then he sat down at the kitchen table, because it wasn't that she'd happened to be there. She was always on the porch in the mornings. He'd absorbed that as a general fact about her. She was a porch person, a morning person, a coffee and fresh air person. But Wednesday was a work day, and she started at 9, and her commute was 15 minutes. and there was no particular reason for her to be sitting outside at 7:50 unless she was just out there. In the mornings, regularly, where she could see his driveway. He put both hands flat on the table. All of it landed differently now. The cookies and the coffee and the showing up at exactly the right moment. The book for Maya. The careful, patient, consistent presence. None of it had been accidental. He didn't know whether to be moved or terrified, and the fact that his immediate instinct was terrified told him something he didn't particularly want to know about himself. He picked up his phone. He opened her contact, Claire Harper, neighbor, and stared at it for a full minute. He thought about texting something casual, something low stakes. He genuinely couldn't think of a single thing to say. He put the phone face down on the table. He sat there in his quiet house while the rain came down outside and thought about a woman who had quietly, patiently, deliberately woven herself into the edges of his life for almost a year. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with any kind of pressure or demand, just steadily, like water finding its way into stone. She'd seen something in him worth being patient about. That was the part that broke something loose in his chest. Because Ethan Brooks had spent years, long, quiet years, believing the opposite. Believing that what Melissa had said was simply the truth, plainly stated. That he was too quiet, too plain, too lacking in whatever quality made a person worth choosing and staying for. He'd built his whole life around that belief, and somewhere in the process, a woman with dark eyes and a library card, and a habit of talking to her tomato plants had been quietly, persistently proving him wrong, and he'd been too buried in his own conviction to see it. He sat at the table until the rain stopped. Then he stood up, found his phone again, and typed. "Congratulations on the promotion. You've earned it." He read it back. It was nothing. It was completely insufficient for everything sitting underneath it. It was also the most honest thing he'd been able to say without his hands shaking. He sent it. 3 minutes passed. Her reply came back. "Thank you. Are you doing okay?" He stared at that for a long time. Are you doing okay? Not what does this mean or where do we go from here, just that. Simple, straightforward. She wanted to know if he was okay. He typed back, "Getting there," then deleted it. Typed, "Working on it." Deleted that too. Finally typed, "Ask me again tomorrow," and sent it before he could second-guess it. This time, 2 minutes passed. Then, "I will." He put the phone down. He exhaled for what felt like the first time in 4 days. And then, because this was the moment, because something in the air had shifted and his chest had cracked open just enough that he could almost see what was inside. His phone buzzed again. Not a text. A call. From a number he recognized immediately. A number he hadn't seen in almost 2 years. Melissa. He stared at the screen. He had maybe 5 seconds to decide whether to answer before it would go to voicemail and become someone else's problem. He stood there in his kitchen, watching his ex-wife's name light up his screen, and something cold moved through him. Not anger, not exactly, but something older and heavier. Something that had been packed away in a box he didn't open anymore. He thought about Claire's message. "Ask me again tomorrow." He thought about, "I will." He thought about the navy blue bathrobe hanging on the back of the bathroom door upstairs. He answered. "Melissa," he said. His voice came out steady. That surprised him. A pause. Then her voice, familiar in all the ways he wished it wasn't. "Ethan, hey." Another pause. "I'm going to be in Harlow Lake this weekend. I want to see Maya." "Okay," he said. "I thought I'd let you know first." "I appreciate that." Silence stretched between them. The particular silence of two people who once knew everything about each other and now knew only that they didn't know each other at all. "You sound different," Melissa said. He looked at the text thread open on his phone. "I will." "I don't know about that," he said. "No," she said slowly. "You do. You sound I don't know. More like yourself. He didn't answer that. I'll be there Saturday afternoon, she said. Around 2. I'll tell Maya. Ethan, I'll tell Maya, he said again, gently this time, and ended the call. He set the phone on the table. He stood in the quiet kitchen and let himself feel the full weight of what had just landed in the room. Melissa. Here. Saturday. Walking back into the house she'd never been to, into the town she'd never bothered to visit, into the life he'd built in the years since she'd told him who he really was. He thought about what Claire had said. I've been standing right next door wondering when you were going to stop believing your ex-wife's version of you. He thought, I am trying. He thought, she has no idea how hard I am trying. And for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't sure whether trying would be enough. He didn't tell Claire that Melissa was coming. He told himself it wasn't her business, that it was a family matter, Maya's mother, visiting her daughter, nothing more complicated than that. He told himself this on Monday and Tuesday and again on Wednesday morning when he caught himself looking out the window toward Claire's porch and then deliberately looking away. He was getting good at deliberately looking away. Maya took the news about her mother with the particular stillness she reserved for things that required careful processing. She didn't jump up. She didn't get excited. She just sat with it for a moment, turning her fork over in her hand, and said, "What does she want?" "To see you." She said that? She said she'd be here Saturday at 2. Maya was quiet for another few seconds. "And you're okay with that?" "It's not about me," Ethan said. "She's your mom." Maya looked at him the way she sometimes did, like she was reading something behind the words, something he hadn't intended to put there. She was 17 going on 40, this kid. She'd learned to see around corners early, the way children of fractured homes often do, and it had made her sharp in ways that occasionally broke his heart. "She's not staying here," Maya said. Not a question. "No." "Okay." She picked up her fork again. "Okay, Saturday." He nodded. That was Tuesday night. By Thursday, the knowledge of Melissa's upcoming visit had settled into him like weather. That low-pressure feeling before a storm. When the air gets heavy and everything feels slightly wrong. He couldn't point to any specific fear. It wasn't that he thought Melissa would do anything dramatic. It wasn't even that he dreaded seeing her exactly. It was that Melissa had a way of making him remember things, not just the bad things. That would have been easier. She made him remember the whole story. Who he'd been when they met, what he'd wanted, what he'd thought he was capable of. And somewhere in the middle of that story was a version of Ethan that had believed in himself, and then, slowly, over years, had been talked out of it. Not through cruelty exactly, through the slow accumulation of small corrections. You're too quiet at parties. You're not ambitious enough. You don't know how to have fun. You never want to go anywhere. You never want to do anything. You're just Ethan. Like that was the problem. Like being Ethan was the thing that needed fixing. He'd internalized it. That was the honest truth he rarely admitted to himself. He'd taken it in and let it become fact. And by the time the marriage ended, he wasn't even angry at Melissa anymore. He was just confirmed in what he'd suspected about himself all along. That was what Saturday threatened. Not Melissa's presence, the memory she carried with her. Thursday evening, his phone buzzed. "Claire, saw your light on late. You sleeping okay?" He stared at the message for a long time. She was watching out for him, not in an intrusive way, in the way someone watches out for a person they've decided matters to them, whether or not that person has caught up to the decision yet. He typed back, "Not great. Got some things on my mind. Claire, do you want to talk about it?" He thought about that. Thought about what talking about it would actually mean. Telling her about Melissa. Explaining the history. Watching Claire's face do whatever it would do with that information. Something about it felt too raw, too exposed. He typed, "Not tonight. But thank you." A pause. Then, "Okay. I'm here when you're ready." He put the phone on the nightstand and lay in the dark and thought about what it meant to have someone say, "I'm here when you're ready," and actually mean it. Not as a formality, not as the kind of thing people say because it sounds right. She meant it in the most literal way possible. She was 40 feet away, in the house next door, genuinely available. He didn't know the last time he'd had that. He fell asleep somewhere around midnight and dreamed about nothing he could remember, which was the best he could hope for. Friday came and went. He kept busy. A full schedule of service calls, which he was grateful for. Physical work had always been his best defense against his own head. When his hands were occupied, the rest of him had less room to spiral. He got home at 6. Maya was in the kitchen making something that involved significantly more dishes than seemed necessary. She had music playing, something she'd been into lately, some indie folk artist he didn't know. And she was moving around the kitchen with the easy confidence of someone who'd been cooking in that space her whole life, which she had. That fact hit him sometimes out of nowhere. This was her home. He'd given her that. Whatever else he'd gotten wrong, whatever else he second-guessed about himself, he'd given his daughter a home. "I made pasta," Maya said. "The good kind, not the regular kind." "What's the difference?" "The good kind has effort." He sat down at the table and watched her finish it, and they ate together, and she talked about a project she was doing for her English class. Some analysis of unreliable narrators in modern fiction, which she was clearly excited about in the way she got excited about things that connected to something she cared about. "Claire recommended 3 books for it," Maya said, twirling pasta around her fork. "She said she'd request the interlibrary loans this week." Ethan looked up. "You talked to her about your English project?" "Yeah, like 2 days ago. She was on her porch and I was complaining about it and she basically lit up. You know how she gets about books." He did know. He'd seen it once. A conversation at the mailbox that had started because he'd mentioned offhand that he'd read something years ago, some paperback he'd found in a waiting room, and Claire had looked at him with a kind of focused interest that made him feel like he'd said something more significant than he intended. "She's good with you," he said, without quite planning to. Maya looked at him. Carefully. The way she looked at things she wanted to understand before she responded to. "She's good with both of us," she said. "But you're the one who hasn't figured out what to do about it yet." "Maya, I'm just saying." She held up her fork, peace-offering style. From an outside perspective. He didn't have an answer for that. He let it sit between them and ate his pasta. Saturday arrived with the particular cruelty of days that have been dreaded. It came too quickly and was already there before he'd finished deciding how to feel about it. 2 o'clock. He heard the car in the driveway first. A rental. He could tell from the look of it. Something generic and silver. Then the door opening. Then Melissa. She looked fine. Good, even. That was always the disorienting thing about seeing her. He'd built up a version of her in his memory that was complicated and difficult to look at, and then the real version would show up and she'd just be a person. A person he used to love. A person who'd said things to him that he was still untangling years later, but a person nonetheless. She hugged Maya first, hard and long, and Maya let her, which meant something. Maya didn't hug people she didn't want to hug. Then Melissa looked at Ethan over Maya's shoulder. "You look good," she said. "So do you," he said. They stood there for a moment in the awkward geography of people who once shared a bed and a last name, and now had to figure out where to put their hands. "Can I come in?" she asked. He stepped back from the door. The afternoon was not a disaster. That was the honest summary of it. Melissa and Maya sat in the living room and talked, and Ethan moved in and out, getting drinks, finding something to do in the kitchen, giving them space. He wasn't trying to avoid it. He was trying to be a decent person about a complicated situation, which was what he always tried to do. But then Maya's phone buzzed, and she looked at the screen and said, "Oh, this is Jordan. Mom, can I just... 1 minute." And she disappeared down the hall. And suddenly Ethan was alone in his living room with his ex-wife. Melissa looked around the room slowly, taking it in. "You've made it nice," she said. It's just a house. No, it isn't. She looked at him. I know you, Ethan. You don't do anything halfway. If something's yours, you take care of it. He didn't know what to do with the compliment, so he just nodded. Then she said, Maya seems happy. She is. She talks about the woman next door. Claire, I think. Something shifted in his chest. A small warning, like a change in air pressure. She's a neighbor, he said. Maya likes her. Melissa watched him for a moment with an expression he recognized. The one where she was about to say something she'd been holding on to. Ethan, I'm not here to cause trouble. I want you to know that. I know. I'm saying it because I want to say something, and I don't want you to hear it wrong. She folded her hands in her lap. I know that things I said, during the divorce and before it, I know some of that was ugly and unfair. The room was very still. You're saying that now, he said. I'm saying it now because I should have said it sooner and I didn't. She looked at her hands. I told you things about yourself that I think I said because I needed a reason. I needed you to be insufficient so I could justify what I wanted to do, which was leave. That's not the same thing as those things being true. He sat with that. He'd waited years to hear something in that neighborhood. And now that it was here, sitting in his living room on a Saturday afternoon, he didn't feel what he thought he'd feel. He didn't feel vindicated or relieved or even particularly moved. He felt something more complicated. A kind of tired recognition, like a door opening to a room you've already cleaned out. I appreciate you saying that, he said. And he meant it. He did. But it wasn't the earthquake he might have expected. Melissa looked up. Something moved across her face. Surprise, maybe. Like she'd expected more of a reaction. You really have changed, she said. You seem settled. More settled than I've ever seen you. He thought about Claire on the porch. Claire's voice saying, I've been wondering when you'd stop believing your ex-wife's version of you. Claire's text at 11 at night. I'm here when you're ready. I'm working on it, he said. Maya came back then, sliding her phone into her pocket, and the conversation shifted, and the afternoon moved forward, and by 5 o'clock Melissa was hugging Maya again at the door, telling her she'd call that week, that they'd figure out a longer visit soon. She paused on the porch and looked at Ethan one last time. Be happy, she said. Quietly. Genuinely. You actually deserve it. I should have told you that years ago. She walked to her rental car. He closed the door. He stood in his hallway for a long moment with his back against the door and his eyes on the ceiling. He thought he'd feel something. Relief, grief, something with a clean name. Instead, he just felt this low, steady hum, like an engine running at idle. Something that was neither good nor bad, just present. Maya appeared from the kitchen. She looked at him carefully. You okay? Yeah, he said. And then, because it was true. Actually, yeah. Maya nodded slowly. She seemed different. She was. Did she say something to you when I was on the phone? He looked at his daughter, at the 17-year-old who'd built a whole life in a town she hadn't chosen, who brought home stray feelings the way other kids brought home stray cats, who had figured out more about the people around her than most adults managed in a lifetime. She said some things that needed saying, he told her. Long overdue things. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, Is that going to help you with the thing you've been doing? The not letting yourself have things thing. He looked at her. She looked back, completely unapologetic about the accuracy of it. Maybe, he said. She nodded. Good. She turned back toward the kitchen. I'm going to Jordan's tonight. You should go talk to Claire. Maya. Dad. She turned around. She was not quite smiling, but close. She brought me books. She drives me to school when you're in a jam. She looks at you like... She stopped, shook her head. Just go talk to her. She disappeared into the kitchen, and he heard her gathering her things, and 20 minutes later, The front door closed behind her, and the house went quiet. He sat on the couch. He sat there for a while. He thought about everything Melissa had said. He turned it over. He tested it against the hard, settled belief he'd carried for years, the belief that he was too ordinary, too quiet, too damaged to be worth choosing. And he waited to see if what she'd said would crack it. It didn't. Not by itself. But then he thought about something else. He thought about the furnace in January, the bulb she couldn't reach, the morning with the truck, the cookies, the 11 months of small, deliberate moments that he'd only just understood the full shape of. He thought about, "I'm not going anywhere, Ethan. Just so you know." He thought about, "I will." And then he thought about the fact that it was now 7:15 on a Saturday evening, and there was a woman 40 feet away who had been quietly, patiently telling him something for nearly a year, and he had been responding to it the way he responded to most things, by fixing everyone else's problem and not knocking on anyone else's door with his own. He stood up. He walked to the front door. He opened it. It was warm out, the kind of August evening that doesn't decide to be anything in particular, just warm and still and slightly golden with the last of the light. He stood on his porch for a moment. Claire's porch was empty, but her lights were on, and he could see the low blue flicker of a reading lamp through the front window. He stepped off his porch. He crossed the strip of grass between their houses. He knocked on her door. He heard her inside, the small sounds of someone getting up, setting something down. Then the door opened. Claire was in jeans and a gray sweater, book still in her hand, reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him across driveways and mailboxes and quiet evenings for 11 months. Like he was something she'd been expecting, and also something that still managed to matter. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. A beat. "I knocked on your door," he said. She smiled then, slow and real. "Yeah, you did." "That's..." He exhaled. "That's a first." "I know." She stepped back. "Come in." He crossed her threshold for the first time. Her house was full of books, just like he'd suspected since the day she moved in, and it smelled like coffee and old paper and something warm that he couldn't name, and it felt like the inside of a place where someone actually lived rather than existed. And he stood in her hallway and felt something in his chest give way completely. She led him to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and sat down across from him. And then she waited. She didn't ask. She didn't prompt. She just sat there, patient as she'd always been, and let him find his way to it. And he did. He talked about Melissa's visit. He talked about what she'd said, and how he'd felt, and what it hadn't fixed. He talked about Maya. He talked about the years after the divorce, the quiet years he'd built his walls during, the way he'd let those walls become architecture instead of just protection. He talked for a long time. Claire listened, not performing listening, actually listening, eyes on him, occasional small nods, present in the specific, concentrated way she had, not rushing him toward a point, not preparing her response, just receiving what he was giving. When he finished, she set down her mug. She said, "You knocked on my door tonight. You noticed. I notice everything about you, Ethan. You know that now." She tilted her head slightly. "Why tonight? What was different?" He thought about it honestly. Really thought about it, not just the first thing that came up. "My daughter told me to," he said. Claire laughed. Genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh that filled the room. And he laughed too. The same surprised, unwilling laugh that had come out back in January. And she looked at him again the same way she had then, like she'd found something she'd been looking for. "She's a smart kid," Claire said. "She is," he said. "Takes after her mother." "Her father," Claire said firmly. He looked at her. She held his gaze without flinching. And something passed between them that was more honest than anything he'd managed to say in the entire conversation. An acknowledgement, mutual and quiet and absolutely real, that they were both done pretending things were other than they were. He got home that night at 11:30. He stood in his kitchen in the dark, replaying the evening. the conversation, the kettle, her laugh. The way she'd looked at him when he said, "takes after her mother," and she'd said her father without hesitation, like it was simply true. He thought about Maya asking him if letting himself believe this would help. He thought it might. He thought it might actually help. And then his phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at the screen. A text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. "You should know who you're dealing with. Ask your neighbor about Daniel Whitfield." He read it twice. The name meant nothing to him. Not a single thing. He set the phone face down on the counter. He stood there in his dark kitchen for a long time, and the warmth of the evening, the kettle, the books, her laugh, slowly tilted sideways into something cooler and harder and entirely uncertain. He didn't sleep well that night. He didn't ask her the next morning. He thought about it. He picked up his phone 3 separate times before 8 a.m., typed out different versions of the same question, and deleted every single one, because he didn't know how to ask it without it sounding like an accusation. And he didn't know if he even had the right to ask. They weren't together. They hadn't made any promises. Claire Harper owed him exactly 0 explanations about her past. He knew all of that. He still couldn't put the name down. Daniel Whitfield. He'd run it through his head all night the way you run your tongue over a sore tooth. Not because you want it to hurt, but because you can't stop checking whether it still does. He didn't know the name. He didn't know the number that had sent the text. And he didn't know which bothered him more, the message itself or the fact that someone had sent it at 11:40 on a Saturday night, timed like a grenade rolled under a door. That kind of timing wasn't accidental. Whoever sent it knew exactly what they were interrupting. By 9 a.m. Sunday, he'd resolved to do nothing, to let it go, to trust what he'd felt in her kitchen the night before, the realness of it, the specific weight of a conversation between 2 people who were finally being honest, and not let an anonymous text from a stranger rewrite it. By 9:15, he'd Googled Daniel Whitfield. He wasn't proud of it. He found 3 men with that name in Michigan, a contractor in Detroit, a retired teacher in Kalamazoo, and a third result, a LinkedIn profile, now deactivated, with no photo, associated with Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor, where Claire had lived before Harlow Lake. He closed the browser. He put the phone in a kitchen drawer and went outside to do yard work, which was what he did when he needed to stop thinking, and his hands needed to be doing something that couldn't be argued with. He pulled weeds for 40 minutes. He trimmed the edge of the grass along the driveway. He dragged the recycling bins back from the curb. He did all of it efficiently and without pleasure, moving through the motions the way a man moves when he's not actually present in his own body. At 10:20, Claire's front door opened. He didn't look up right away. He gave himself 3 full seconds before he let himself turn his head. She was in a light jacket, keys in hand, clearly heading somewhere. She saw him and lifted a hand in a wave. Easy, natural, nothing weighted about it. "Morning," she called. "Morning," he said. A pause. Not an uncomfortable one, just the natural pause of 2 people deciding whether a conversation is about to happen. "I'm heading to the farmer's market," she said. "They have good corn this time of year." "They do," he agreed. Another pause. She tilted her head slightly, looked at him with those clear eyes. "You okay?" He had a split second to decide. "Yeah," he said. "Fine. Enjoy the corn." She watched him for just a half-second longer than necessary, the way she always did, like she was reading the margin notes. And then she nodded and got in her car. He watched her pull out and felt like the worst version of himself, not because he'd lied exactly, but because he'd had the chance to simply say, "Hey, can I ask you something?" And instead, he'd said fine and watched her drive away. He'd chosen the wall over the door, and he'd done it so automatically it had barely registered as a choice. He put the yard tools away and went inside. Maya was at the kitchen table with her laptop, working on the English project, surrounded by the 3 books Claire had sourced for her from the interlibrary system. She looked up when he came in, registered his expression, and said nothing, which was its own kind of communication. He made coffee. He stood at the counter. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Maya looked up again. Yeah. Did Claire ever mention someone named Daniel Whitfield to you? Maya's face did something he watched carefully. A small, honest flicker of recognition. Not guilt. Not evasion. Just recognition. Where did you hear that name? She asked. His stomach tightened. I asked first. Maya set her pen down. She turned in her chair to face him properly, which meant she'd decided this was a real conversation. She mentioned him once, like 2 months ago. We were talking on the porch, and I asked why she moved from Ann Arbor, and she said it was partly the job opportunity, and partly because she needed distance from a situation that had gotten complicated. Complicated how? She didn't say exactly. She said there was someone she'd been involved with who didn't handle the end of things well. Maya watched him carefully. Dad? What's going on? He told her about the text. He read it to her. He watched her face go from careful to quiet to something harder. That's not okay, Maya said. Someone sending you that at 11 at night. That's not a concerned friend passing along information. That's someone trying to cause damage. I know. So why are you standing in the kitchen pulling weeds in your head instead of just asking her? He looked at his daughter. Sometimes she was so clear-eyed about things that it felt like a mild embarrassment to be her father. Like he was still working on lessons she'd already passed. Because I don't know how, he said. Honestly, Maya looked at him for a long moment. You knocked on her door last night, she said. You told me this morning that was hard. You did it anyway. She turned back to her laptop. Same thing. He stood there. He drank his coffee. He thought about it. She was back by noon. He heard her car, heard her front door, heard the particular quietness of her house settling back into occupied. He waited until 12:30. Then he crossed the yard again and knocked. She opened the door with a paper bag of vegetables still in her arm and a question already forming on her face. She could tell from his expression that this wasn't casual. Can I come in? He said. Of course. She stepped back. She set the bag on her kitchen counter and turned to face him, and didn't pretend she didn't know something had shifted since that morning. Talk to me, she said. He pulled out his phone. He found the text. He held it out to her. She took the phone. She read it. He watched her face with the same careful attention she always gave to him, and what he saw was not guilt or shame or the startled look of someone caught. What he saw was something older and more exhausted. Recognition. And then, underneath it, a slow-burning anger she was clearly working to keep level. She handed the phone back. Daniel Whitfield, she said. Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. Then she moved to the kitchen table and sat down, and she folded her hands on the table in front of her, and she took a breath. We dated for 2 years, she said, in Ann Arbor. He was charming in the beginning. The kind of charming that you confuse for substance, when you're not paying close enough attention. She paused. I was working at the university library. He was in the business school. We moved in together after 8 months, which I knew even at the time was too fast, but I convinced myself it was confidence. Ethan sat down across from her. He said nothing. He let her find her own pace. It started small, Claire said, the way it always starts small. He didn't like certain friends of mine. He had opinions about how I dressed when we went out. He said things, and then said I'd misunderstood. Standard playbook. She looked at her hands. I'm a reasonably intelligent person, and I stayed for 1.5 years after I knew I should leave. I'm not proud of that, but it's what happened. When you left? He didn't take it quietly. Her voice stayed even, but something in it went careful. The way your voice goes careful when you're carrying something heavy and you don't want to spill it. He called. He showed up at my work. He emailed people we knew together, told them his version of things, which was a version in which I had been the problem all along. She paused. And when that didn't work, he started, appearing, not threatening, not anything you could point to in a police report, just present, in places he knew I'd be. Ethan felt something cold move through him. That's why you moved, he said. I loved Harlow Lake before I needed it, she said carefully. I used to come up here in summers as a kid. But yes, distance was part of the calculation. And he's been quiet since you moved? Until now, apparently. She looked at him steadily. That number, I don't recognize it. But it's him. Or someone doing this for him. That's not coincidence, Ethan. Someone has been watching my life closely enough to know your number and to time a message for exactly when it would do the most damage. The weight of that settled over both of them. He thought about the message. Ask your neighbor about Daniel Whitfield. Not threatening, not explicit, just a seed, planted at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right soil. Because whoever sent it had understood something, that the most effective way to damage something fragile was not to attack it directly, but to introduce doubt and let the doubt do the work. And it had almost worked. He'd spent the whole morning pulling weeds in his own head instead of just crossing the yard. Why didn't you tell me? He said. She met his eyes. Because it's not the first thing I wanted you to know about me. Claire, I know, she said. I know, I probably should have mentioned it before. But when do you bring something like that up? We were barely having real conversations. And then we were. And I didn't want the first real thing to be... She stopped, pressed her lips together. He's not part of my life. I've worked very hard to make sure he's not part of my life. I didn't want to drag him into the space between us. Ethan looked at her for a long time. She looked back. And he could see what it cost her to have this out in the open. Not shame, exactly, but a kind of weariness. The specific exhaustion of someone who's dealt with something hard in private for a long time and has gotten very good at not letting it show. He doesn't get to do this, Ethan said. She blinked. What? Whoever sent that text, Daniel or someone acting for him, they don't get to do this. He heard the steadiness in his own voice and was mildly surprised by it. They sent it to make me doubt you. They picked the right moment, they planted the right name, and they were counting on me to do exactly what I did this morning, which was stand in my yard and not talk to you. He set his phone on the table. But I'm sitting here talking to you. And I'm asking you directly, and you told me, so they lost. Claire stared at him. She looked at him the way she sometimes did, like she'd found something she hadn't expected. Ethan, she said quietly. I'm not saying it's over, he said. If he's watching closely enough to have my number, that's a problem. A real one. And I think you should document it. And I think we should take it seriously. We, she said. Not challenging, just noting the word. Yeah, he said. We. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, When did you get like this? Like what? Like someone who shows up. He thought about Maya's voice that morning. You knocked on her door last night. Same thing. He thought about 11 months of Claire on her porch, at his mailbox, at his door, quiet and patient and absolutely present. He thought about what it cost a person to keep showing up for someone who kept almost, but not quite, receiving it. I had a good example, he said. Something moved across her face. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat like that for a moment. Not dramatically, not with any kind of declaration, just two people on a Sunday afternoon deciding together that something was real. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. She didn't move to get it immediately. She kept her eyes on him. It buzzed again. He nodded toward it. You should check that. She got up. She looked at the screen. And he watched her face do something he hadn't seen before. A sequence of expressions he couldn't fully track, moving too fast. Something that started as confusion and ended somewhere he couldn't name. She turned the phone so he could see the screen. It was a screenshot. A photo, actually, of Claire, taken from a distance, through what looked like a car window. She was on her porch, reading. In the late evening light, the timestamp in the corner of the photo was from 6 days ago, and the message underneath it, sent from a different unknown number than the first text, said only, "You should have stayed in Ann Arbor." Ethan stood up, his chair scraped back. He was on his feet before he'd fully processed the decision to stand, and something had changed in his body. Not anger, not panic, but a kind of absolute clarity. The clarity you get when something stops being abstract and becomes very, very concrete. "Call the police," he said. "Ethan." "Claire." His voice was level, completely level. "Someone took that photo from outside your house 6 days ago. That is not ambiguous. Call the police." She looked at the photo again. He could see her processing it. The librarian's brain, methodical, careful, trying to categorize the information. But underneath the processing was something she'd been keeping very controlled all morning, and it was starting to show at the edges. Her hands weren't quite steady when she set the phone down. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." He sat back down. He wasn't going anywhere. He stayed at that table while she made the call, and he listened to her describe the situation in the calm, precise way she described everything. And he watched her hold herself together with the particular dignity of someone who has had practice at it, and something settled in him that had been unsettled for years. This was where he was supposed to be. Not because it was dramatic or romantic or cinematic, but because Claire Harper needed someone to stay in the room, and Ethan Brooks was very, very good at staying. The officer who came was thorough and respectful. He took both screenshots, took Claire's account of the history with Daniel, noted the Ann Arbor connection, and said they'd reach out to the Ann Arbor PD to establish a pattern of contact. He was there for 45 minutes. When he left, the house went quiet. Claire sat at her kitchen table with a mug of tea she'd made and not yet touched, and Ethan sat across from her, and neither of them said anything for a minute. Then Claire said, "Thank you for staying." "Where else would I be?" She looked at him, and this time the look was different from all the previous ones. Different from the patient ones. Different from the careful ones. This one was something more unguarded. More open to the actual air of the room. "I've been watching you for 11 months, she said, "wondering when you'd let yourself be here." "I'm working on the timeline," he said. She almost smiled. Almost. Her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't quite composed, and he thought that might be the realest he'd ever seen her. "He's going to try again," she said. Not a question. Probably. "And you're not going to run." He looked at her steadily. "Claire, I fixed furnaces in January for 11 years before I figured out I was good at it. I'm not fast, but I don't leave jobs half done." This time she did smile. Full and real and slightly undone at the edges. He drove home that night at 9 o'clock and found Maya asleep on the couch with her book on her chest and the TV on low volume, and he stood in the doorway looking at her for a moment. This kid he'd built a life around. This person who was going to be an adult before he had finished being amazed by her, and felt something he rarely let himself feel without immediately cataloging the reasons it was temporary. He felt grateful. For the house, for Maya, for the 40 feet of grass between his front door and Claire's. He turned off the TV. He went to bed. His phone buzzed once more at 11:15. Unknown number, different from the first two. One word. Careful. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he set the phone on the nightstand, screen down, and closed his eyes. Whoever was out there, Daniel Whitfield, a proxy, someone operating in the shadows of Claire's past. They wanted him afraid. They wanted the doubt back. They wanted the wall to go back up. He thought about what he'd said at her kitchen table. They lost. He kept that thought. He held it steady. And this time, for the first time in a very long time, it held. The week after the police report was the strangest week of Ethan's life. Not because anything dramatic happened. Because nothing did. No more texts. No unknown numbers. No photos. Just ordinary days that felt anything but ordinary. Because he was living them differently than he'd lived any day in recent memory. With the door open instead of closed. With his attention pointed outward instead of inward. With the constant low awareness of a man who has decided to stop managing his life from a safe distance. He checked on Claire every day. Not in a hovering way. Not in a way that crowded her. He knew, without having to think about it much, that Claire Harper was not a woman who wanted to be hovered over. She'd built a whole life on her own terms, made hard decisions alone, crossed the state to start over. She didn't need a protector. But there was a difference between protection and presence, and he was learning to offer the second without confusing it for the first. Monday morning he texted her, "Coffee on if you want some before work." She came over at 7:40 and drank it standing at his kitchen counter, talking to Maya about the English project while Ethan made toast. And the three of them moved around his kitchen like it was the most natural thing in the world. And it was only after Claire left and Maya grabbed her backpack that his daughter paused at the door and said, very quietly, "That's what it's supposed to feel like, Dad." Then she was gone. He stood in the kitchen with that sentence and turned it over for a long time. Tuesday. The Ann Arbor police called Claire. They'd made contact with Daniel Whitfield. He'd denied sending the messages. They couldn't prove he had, but they'd delivered what the officer called a clear communication of consequences, which was police language for, he now knows there's a paper trail, and if anything else happens, he's the first name on the list. Claire relayed this to Ethan that evening in her kitchen, calm and precise, and when she finished, she exhaled one long, slow breath and said, "Okay, I think it's okay." "You don't sound sure," he said. "I'm sure enough," she said. "He's a coward. Cowards don't like paper trails." She said it with a steadiness that told him she'd been carrying the weight of Daniel Whitfield for a long time. Not in fear, but in the low, constant vigilance of someone who'd learned they had to. And he understood, sitting there, that part of what he could offer her wasn't fixing the problem. The problem was largely handled. What he could offer was the simple, radical thing of not making her carry it alone anymore. He said, "You've been dealing with this by yourself for a long time." She looked at him. "Yes. You don't have to anymore." The words came out simple and direct, and she received them the same way. Not with drama, not with tears. Just a slow nod and the particular silence of someone who has been waiting to hear something and is now quietly absorbing it. Wednesday was when things moved. Not with Daniel. With them. He'd been thinking for days about the conversation he needed to have. The one that wasn't about Daniel, wasn't about the texts, wasn't about any external thing. The one that was just about the two of them and what was actually happening between them and whether they were both willing to say it out loud in plain language. He was bad at those conversations. He knew that. He'd spent years avoiding them, finding workarounds, letting things stay unspoken because unspoken things couldn't be held against you. But he was also aware, painfully, clearly aware, that the unspoken had a cost too. He'd paid that cost for years. He was done paying it. Wednesday evening he knocked on her door. She opened it and looked at him and said, "Hi." And then, "This is a different kind of knock." "Yeah," he said. "Can I come in?" She stepped back. They sat in her living room. Not the kitchen this time, not the functional space, but the room with the books and the reading lamp and the low, comfortable couch. She sat at one end and he sat at the other, and there was enough space between them that they could both breathe. And he looked at her and said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to just let me get through it without stopping me. Because if you stop me, I'm going to lose the thread." She straightened slightly. "Okay. I have spent 9 years," he said, "telling myself a story about who I am. And the story goes like this. I'm a good father, a decent neighbor, an honest worker, and not the kind of man a woman looks at twice. Not out of self-pity, just fact. I believed it the way you believe a thing when it's been told to you often enough by someone close enough to your center that their words get written in." He looked at his hands. "Melissa didn't destroy me. I want to be fair about that. But she confirmed something I already half believed. And once it was confirmed, I built my whole life around it being true." Claire was perfectly still. Not holding herself still. Just still. Listening the way she listened. "And then you moved in next door," he said. "And you spent 11 months being the most quietly persistent person I've ever encountered. And slowly, without me fully tracking how it was happening, you started proving the story wrong. Not by arguing with it, just by..." showing up, paying attention, making it impossible to ignore. He looked at her. I'm not good at this. I don't have the right words for most of it. But what I know is that for the first time in 9 years, I woke up last Monday morning, and the first thing I thought about wasn't something I needed to fix or manage or get through. It was you. And that scared me. And I'm done letting it scare me. The room was quiet. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was the most open he'd ever seen it. All the careful patience stripped back, just her face, just whatever was actually there. Ethan, she said. I'm not finished, he said. She closed her mouth. I know I come with things, he said. I know there's a kid and a past and a version of me that's still learning how to take up space. I know I'm not easy, and I know I waited way longer than I should have to knock on your door. But I'm here now, and I need to know if what I think is happening is actually happening. Because I can't read it and stay comfortable anymore. I need to know. Silence. Then Claire said, How long have you needed to know? Since the bathrobe, he said. Probably since before that. She held his gaze. Since before the bathrobe, she confirmed. For me. So it's real. It's real, she said, simply, completely, like it had always been real, and was only now being given its proper name. He exhaled. She crossed the couch. She didn't say anything else, and she didn't have to. She sat close enough that their arms were touching, and she leaned her head back and looked at the ceiling, and he looked at the ceiling too, and neither of them said a word, for what felt like a long time, but was probably 3 minutes, and it was the most settled he'd felt in years. Maybe ever. Then she said, You have terrible timing, you know. I know. 11 months, Ethan. I know. I brought you cookies. I kept the tin. She turned her head and looked at him. You kept the tin? In the junk drawer. With the dead batteries. She stared at him. Then she laughed. The full, real laugh that filled whatever room it was in. And he laughed too, and it broke something open, and let the air in, and he thought, This is the thing. Not the grand gesture, not the declaration, not even the honesty, as necessary as that had been. This. 2 people on a couch at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night, laughing about a cookie tin. This was what he'd been afraid to want. 2 weeks passed. They were quiet weeks on the surface, but underneath they were anything but quiet. They were weeks of small adjustments, of 2 people recalibrating around the fact that something had been named. Coffee in the morning, sometimes at his place, sometimes at hers. Dinners that started as separate plans and ended combined. Maya moved through all of it with the serene satisfaction of someone watching a long-delayed outcome finally arrive, which she was only moderately subtle about. One evening, Maya was helping Claire bring a box of library books to her car, some community donation thing she'd organized. And Ethan watched them from his porch, the 2 of them laughing at something he couldn't hear, and felt a specific kind of fullness that he didn't have a word for. Not happiness, exactly. Deeper than that. More specific. Like seeing something take root. That Saturday, 3 weeks after the police report, Ethan's phone rang. A Michigan number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then he answered. Mr. Brooks? A woman's voice, professional, clipped. This is Detective Casey Oren with the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling regarding a report filed by a Ms. Claire Harper. Are you familiar with the situation? I am, he said. We've been investigating the communications Ms. Harper received and have made an arrest this morning. Daniel Whitfield was taken into custody on charges including criminal stalking and unauthorized surveillance. We found, among other things, equipment consistent with remote monitoring of Ms. Harper's property. A pause. I wanted her to hear it from a person rather than a text, but she's not picking up. I understand you're a close contact. Ethan sat down on his porch step. I'll tell her, he said. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. He sat there for 60 seconds after the call ended. Just sat. processing the information the way you process something that changes the shape of a situation you'd been bracing yourself to live with indefinitely. Then he stood up, crossed the yard, and knocked on Claire's door. She opened it with her reading glasses on and a library catalog printout in her hand, and the expression of someone pulled out of a task. "Sit down," he said. Something in his voice made her go still. "Ethan, what happened?" "Good news," he said. "Real good news. Sit down and I'll tell you." She sat on the front step. He sat beside her. And he told her what the detective had said, and he watched her face go through a sequence that started with stunned and moved through something complicated and landed somewhere that was very much relief but carried the particular weight of relief that comes after a long time carrying fear. She didn't cry. He'd half expected her to. But she just sat there with her catalog printout forgotten in her hand, looking at the street, breathing. "It's over," she said. "Yeah. It's actually over." "Yeah, Claire, it's over." She turned and looked at him. Something in her face was completely unguarded in a way he'd never seen. Not the patient, composed Claire, not the careful, precise Claire, just her. Whatever was underneath all the competence and calm. "I've been waiting for something bad to happen for 2 years," she said. "Every time I thought I was past it, something would remind me. And I kept waiting." "You don't have to anymore," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned her head onto his shoulder, which she'd never done before, and they sat on her front step in the September afternoon, and he didn't say anything because there was nothing to say, and she didn't say anything either, and the neighborhood moved quietly around them. A car going by, someone's dog barking 2 houses down, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary Saturday. And it was, he thought, the most at peace he could remember feeling on any given afternoon of his adult life. They stayed like that for a long time. October came. The lake went steel-colored, and the air went sharp, and the neighborhood pulled itself inward the way Michigan neighborhoods do when fall gets serious. Claire's tomato plants came in from the porch. Ethan's truck developed a new noise that turned out to be nothing. Maya started applications to 3 colleges, and the dinner table conversations got bigger and scarier and more exciting. And once when Ethan was sitting at the table at midnight reading through financial aid paperwork, Claire appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had a key now. They'd gotten to keys somehow without making a ceremony of it. With 2 mugs of tea, and sat down across from him and helped him read through the forms until 1 in the morning. When Maya found out the next day, she'd looked at the papers and then at her father and said, "She did this?" "She helped," Ethan said. Maya had gone very quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, you should not let her go." "I know," he said. "I'm serious." "Maya, I know." She'd given him the look. Then she'd picked up her backpack and gone to school, and he'd stood in the kitchen holding his coffee cup and thought, "I know. I'm not letting go of this. I'm done being the man who can't believe good things are real. I'm done treating abundance like a mistake." November. The first genuinely cold night. The kind of cold that gets into the house no matter how good the insulation is. The kind of cold that makes you aware of walls and warmth, and the specific value of being indoors. He'd invited Claire and Maya to watch a movie. Something low stakes. Some comedy Maya had been pushing for months. The 3 of them on the couch under a shared blanket. Maya in the middle initially, and then quietly, diplomatically at the far end. Giving them space in the way only a teenager who wants something to work out gives space. At some point during the movie, Claire fell asleep against his shoulder. He didn't move. He sat completely still and watched the rest of the film and felt the weight of her there and thought about the navy blue bathrobe hanging on the back of the bathroom door upstairs, and the night all of this had started, and the 8 words that had cracked his life open at the seams. When the credits rolled, Maya looked over and saw Claire asleep and looked at her father with an expression he'd remember for the rest of his life. Not a smirk, not a teenage told you so, but something genuinely warm. Happy, actually. His daughter was happy. He mouthed, "Go to bed." She went to bed. He sat there. An hour later, Claire stirred and lifted her head and looked around with the mild confusion of someone coming back from sleep. She saw the dark TV screen and then him and said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Don't be sorry," he said. She looked at him, slow and clear. "What time is it?" "Late." She nodded. She did not move to get up immediately. She sat there beside him in the quiet house, and there was something in the room that was the specific accumulated weight of all the months behind them, all the careful, necessary steps they'd both taken to get here. And it had a mass to it, a substance, the way real things have substance. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. He reached back over the side of the couch and came up with something he'd put there before the movie started. The navy blue bathrobe. Folded. He set it between them on the cushion. She stared at it. Then she looked at him. "You kept this?" she said. "I keep things," he said. A long beat. Then Claire started laughing. Quietly, fully, the realest laugh she had. And he was already smiling before it started, because he'd known it was coming, because he knew her now, and knowing her was the thing he hadn't believed he'd get to do, and here he was doing it. When she stopped laughing, she looked at the bathrobe and then at him with eyes that were bright and warm and completely unguarded. "Do you remember what I said that night?" she asked. "Verbatim," he said. She reached out and touched the edge of the robe. "I meant it about more than pretending you weren't lonely." "I know," he said. "I meant that you'd been pretending no one could love you." She looked at him. "And I was tired of watching you be wrong about yourself." He held her gaze. 9 years of building walls. 9 years of taking up as little space as possible. 9 years of being thoroughly convinced that ordinary Ethan Brooks from Linden Street was not the kind of man who got chosen and held on to and built something with. And here was the evidence to the contrary, sitting right next to him on the couch. "I'm done pretending," he said. She nodded. "Good." He picked up the bathrobe and held it out to her. She took it. And just like that, not with a grand speech, not with a moment designed for anyone's consumption but their own, Ethan Brooks stopped being a man who was waiting to become someone worth choosing and started being exactly what he'd always been. Enough. More than enough. Precisely, specifically, irreplaceably enough for the woman who had crossed 40 feet of grass every which way for 11 months to prove it to him. The lake outside was steel and cold, and the house was warm, and Maya was asleep upstairs, and Claire was here, and this, all of this, was his actual life. Not the placeholder, not the in-between, not the version he'd settled for while the real thing waited somewhere he'd never be good enough to reach. This was it. This was the real thing. And Ethan Brooks, at 43 years old, in a house on Linden Street, in a town he'd chosen for its anonymity, and ended up choosing for something else entirely. Finally, completely, with both hands, let himself have it.